If you've ever wondered how to get movement in your frame, how to make water look soft and silky, to street lights, or to rid a busy place of people altogether, long exposure photography can get you all of these, and it's a surprisingly easy technique to learn. As the name suggests, you're keeping the camera shutter open longer than usual, allowing you to compress a long period of time into one shot. And this is the reason why you can get that sense of movement in a long exposure, or take that movement to an extreme, blur it out completely to give a sense of stillness. And this shows you've thought about what goes into your frame, giving meaning to your photography, and potentially turning a snapshot into a photograph. Now, if you want to shoot long exposures in the day, you can, but you just have to use ND filters. These reduce the amount of light coming into your camera, enabling you to shoot with much longer exposure times. However, if you don't own any filters, you can still shoot long exposures, and I'll show you how to do that a little bit later on. Your camera basically captures light, and it does that by opening up a hole in the front of it. Your shutter speed is basically how long that hole is open for. A long exposure, like the name suggests, is where that hole is left open for a long time. Now, there are certain scenarios where you might want to shoot with long exposures, but there are other circumstances where you don't really need to. The way I approach this is to work out what I'm photographing and then ask myself what might be moving through the frame. Are the clouds moving? Is there a stream flowing through my shot? Are there people moving through the shot? Or at the beach, are the waves producing interesting shapes that I can capture? You can open the shutter for 1,000th of a second or faster to really freeze that motion, a fraction of a second to give a sense of movement, or open it up for seconds to really give a sense of stillness. Now, a word of warning with clouds: if they're moving really slowly on a calm, still day, a bit like today, you will have to do really long exposures to create any sense of movement. If it's a stormy, windy day, you can create this a lot quicker and a lot easier. On the other hand, if there's nothing really moving in your frame, then there's no real need to shoot long exposures. And this is why shooting handheld is so useful for landscape photography. When it comes to capturing movement in your shot, not all movement is good. If you've got trees in your frame, you might want to get everything sharp apart from that lake being perfectly smooth. And if it's windy and that tree's moving all over the place, this will mess your chances up of getting what you want. Long exposures tend to work well with waterfalls, seascapes, and any kind of landscape where there's something moving in the frame. So watch this. I've got my camera set up and I'm going to take a series of photographs. If I take a shot at 1/25th of a second, I'll be blurred in the shot, but you can make out that I'm a person and I'm in that frame. Now, with that sun coming in and out, I have to add an ND filter. I'm going to put a 6-stop ND filter on this. Next, I'm going to shoot at half a second. Let's see what happens with this. You can see it smeared me out. You can just about work out that I'm a person, but nothing more than that. Next, I'm going to swap the 6-stop ND for a 10-stop ND. I'm going to go for a really long exposure. Then you'll be able to see what happens with this. I've got 25-second exposure, and this is going to take a while to shoot. But I can walk backwards and forwards without too much of a worry of me becoming anything in that frame whatsoever. It's amazing how it works. That frame is completely void of me whatsoever. Even wearing this bright orange top, I don't stand out at all. Now, it's well worth trying this exercise for yourself. If you live in a city, go out to a busy place and start taking photographs of that place, from really short exposures to really long exposures. It's amazing how different you can make that same place look with just different exposure times. The first thing to do is work out whether you want to show movement or not in your frame. Is there something moving slowly, or is there something moving really fast through your frame? If it's fast, you can get away with shorter exposure times, but if it's moving really slowly, you'll have to shoot with much longer exposure times. Again, knowing this comes down to building up those experiences you have in the field. But the one great thing with this technique is that you need to be slow and methodical, so you can take your time and you can take lots of different shots and see what you like the best. Now, the longer you leave your shutter open for, the more things moving in your frame will blur. But this also means when you're shooting handheld, that movement will transfer from your hands, or if you're pressing the shutter button or touching the camera at all. So a tripod is a must. Once you've found a good composition that you think is worthy of a long exposure, get your camera on a tripod and make sure it's out of the wind. You can hang a bag from the bottom of the tripod, but I've found that it can swing about and cause more problems than it solves. So just get low and out of the wind and it'll make your life a lot easier. If you shoot with a DSLR, you need to use the lock-up mirror function. There are plenty of videos online to show you how to do that. Just search for mirror lockup with the model of camera you have here on YouTube. If you shoot with a mirrorless camera, as the name suggests, there's no mirror, so you don't need to do this. Put your camera in manual mode. Put your camera in the self-timer mode or use a shutter release cable. If your lens has image stabilization, turn it off. I turn off long exposure noise reduction as it doubles the time of the exposure to process that image, no matter if it's a RAW file or a JPEG. I have a video on what this actually does to your photos if you're interested in it. Links in the description. Next, close the aperture down to f16. Avoid the smallest apertures like f22. At these apertures, your photos can become softer due to diffraction. Use the lowest ISO your camera has. On mine, it's ISO 50, but a lot of cameras have a minimum of 100. Then lower your shutter speed until you get a good exposure. To do this for now, just get your light meter scale in your camera to 0. From this point, you can push it one way or another a little, depending on how your exposure looks on the back of the camera and on your histogram. Focus on your subject and switch it to manual focus. Or if you use back button focusing, just focus it and don't worry about it. With modern cameras, you can do this at any point through the setup, but make sure you do it before adding any filters. Talking of filters, if the shutter speed is not long enough for what you want, you will need an ND filter, which are basically like sunglasses for your camera. But if you don't have any filters and you want to shoot long exposures, go out later in the day, just wait for that sun to go down and then start shooting. As the sun sets, you'll be able to extend that exposure time. And this is the trick to shooting long exposures without filters. And once it gets really dark, you can take really long exposures. Now, if you get your exposure time to 30 seconds and you still need more time to get a good exposure, this is where you need to use bulb mode with a shutter release cable. With the camera I'm using, bulb mode is one click beyond 30 seconds. Use a shutter release cable to control when you open and close the shutter. Now, there are a few settings that stop this from being accessible, like burst mode. So if you want to use bulb mode, just switch the drive mode to single shot and it should become available. Now, shutter release cables normally have these locking buttons on them. You press and hold it to keep that shutter open, and if you're shooting a really long exposure, you can lock that button in place. And then you unlock it and release it to close the shutter. This one has a self-timer on it, but not all of them do. When you do use a shutter release cable in bulb mode, you will have to calculate your exposure times. In this scenario, at 30 seconds, it's 2 stops under. So to get a good exposure, I'd have to shoot for 2 minutes. Once you've done all of that, take the shot. There is a lot of waiting around with long exposure photography. Just make sure you don't touch or move your camera whilst it's taking the photograph. Once you have taken the shot, check the still parts to make sure they're sharp. It's amazing how even the slightest bit of wind on your tripod can blur your photograph. Another thing to note is that if you're shooting with a DSLR, the viewfinder is optical, so it will let light in, and some of that light can leak onto the sensor, so you will need to cover it. If you have the Canon camera, on the original strap, there's a rubber piece that clips over the viewfinder. But if you don't have this, just cover it with a cloth. With mirrorless cameras, this isn't a problem because that viewfinder is electrical. If you want to shoot long exposures in the middle of the day and the sun's out, you definitely will need ND filters. Now, if you're wondering what strength of filter to get first, I'd suggest getting a 6-stop filter. You might not be able to shoot really long exposures in the middle of the day, but as that sun sets, you will be able to shoot long exposures, and much longer than you would be able to without a filter. This is a nice introduction to long exposure photography. Now, if you don't know what a stop is, it's basically a relative measurement of light. So if I'm taking a photograph, it doesn't matter what the settings are in the camera. If I want to add a stop of light, I'd have to double the amount of light getting into the camera. Whereas on the other hand, if I wanted to remove a stop of light, I'd have to half the amount getting into the camera. So a 3-stop filter reduces the amount of light by halving that light 3 times. So basically it's letting in 1/8 of the light it would if it didn't have that filter on. When you add a 10-stop filter, this will give you 1/1000th the amount of light. So you can really see it's a logarithmic scale. When you add your ND filter, you will need to calculate that new shutter speed from the exposure that you got before you added the filter. ND filters are either measured in optical density, the ND factor, or stops. If it's a 3-stop filter, it has an ND factor of 8 and an optical density of 0.9. That's a 3-stop reduction of light. With a 6-stop filter, it has an ND factor of 64 and an optical density of 1.8. that's a 6-stop reduction of light. And with a 10-stop filter, an ND factor of 1000, an optical density of 3, that's a 10-stop reduction of light. So if you get a good exposure without the filter at 1/1000th of a second, if you use a 3-stop filter, you can drop that shutter speed to 1/125th of a second and still get a good exposure. If you use a 6-stop filter, you can drop that shutter speed to 1/15th of a second and get a good exposure. And with a 10-stop filter, you can use an exposure time of 1 second. Now you can either calculate this yourself, or there are a load of apps that will tell you what to do exactly. I've got the Lee Pro Glass app, and it's free and you don't need to own any Lee glass to use it. You basically tell it what filter you're using, what the shutter speed is without the filter, and then it'll tell you what the shutter speed needs to be once you've added that filter. So no need to do any kind of calculations, the app does everything for you. Filters come in all shapes and sizes, from the really big square ones that need a special bracket to sit in, to the circular ones that screw onto the front of your lens, and nowadays you can get ones that clip in just in front of the sensor behind your lens. The big square filters look professional, but they cost a lot of money. They do take up quite a bit of space in your bag. They all serve a purpose, and I have filters in each one of these systems, and the one I find I keep using more and more is the circular one that I just screw onto the front. Now you can get variable ND filters, and these use polarization to change the amount of light that they let through. Now the problem with these is that they cause a lot more issues than they're worth. They're really good for videography, but not so good for photography. You sometimes get the polarization that you don't actually want in your frame, as well as some of the older ones causing an X pattern in your frame that's almost impossible to Photoshop out of that photograph. So to keep it easy, just use solid ND filters. Now, if you are considering buying your first filter, I'd avoid the cheap filters because sometimes they can give you a horrible color cast. I use the Freewell ND filters, and these work really well and don't give a color shift when I attach them. By color shift, I mean that when you put the filter on the camera, the colors change in the shot. Sometimes you can get strange greens, strange magentas or reds appearing in your shot after you attach the filter. So you want to avoid this so you can edit the photograph as normal. With a stream or waterfall, I like shooting them at around about 1/6 of a second to about half a second. This gives a sense of movement as well as keeping some of the texture in that water. If you start shooting them at 1 second or longer, they'll start to smooth out completely and you'll lose all texture in the water. However, if the water movement is slow, then you will need to shoot longer exposure times. For instance, with this swirling pool of water, I had to combine 5 30-second exposures to get it looking how I wanted. Also with waterfalls, it's worth coming out on overcast days. This will give you flat light and the chance to shoot them without any ND filters at all. At this location, I actually liked how the water looked at 1/13th of a second the best, so I don't always stick to these numbers. I just use them as a starting point and work from there. At 1 second, this is what this waterfall looks like. For me, I prefer having a bit of texture, but it all comes down to what you like and your own personal taste. If you want to show movement in clouds, it is a little bit tricky, and this could be a whole video in itself. What I tend to do is look at the wind speed and the cloud height. If they're really high clouds, I probably won't be able to show that movement too well because they're so far away that they would have to be moving so fast through the frame to be able to show any movement in them. When I took these shots, the sun was breaking through some cumulus clouds and the wind was blowing at about 10 miles per hour. This is a 2-minute exposure and this is a 5-minute exposure. So you can see with the lower wind speeds, you do have to shoot really long exposures. If you're shooting at the beach and it's perfectly still, there's no movement to capture. Whereas if there's wind on the water or if there's waves coming in, this is when you can capture that motion. Again, it all depends on the speed of the waves in the water, but I find anything between 1/10 and 1 second works really well. If you have a scene that you want to take out all movement from the sea, once again, you'll need a strong ND filter, like this 10-stop ND. This is a photo without the filter, and this is one with a 10-stop ND. You can see it totally alters the look of the shot. Now, if you are getting good exposures, but your photos don't have anything about them, you need to start developing your own style. And in this video, I cover everything that you need to know. I'll see you next time.